You know how it is, global events move so fast, and you really want to get a handle on what's actually important, but without getting totally swamped by the newsfeed.
Exactly.
So that's what we're trying to do right here. Welcome to this deep dive.
Today, yeah, we're diving into some recent statements and moves by former President Trump, specifically looking at Yemen, Ukraine, and the wider Middle East.
Right, and we're doing this through the lens of some expert analysis, drawing especially on insights from a former White House advisor. Is that right?
That's the plan, using that perspective to unpack things.
Okay, so our mission today basically is to pull out the key takeaways from this analysis. Understand potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy, what it means for America's image, maybe, and just the bigger picture for global stability.
Sounds good.
All right, let's dive in. Maybe start with Yemen and the Houthis.
Sure. So right off the bat, there's this fascinating reported agreement
Mm-hmm.
between Trump and the Houthis.
An agreement. What were the supposed terms?
Well, the report suggests the U.S. would stop its bombings in Yemen. Okay.
And in return, the Houthis would stop attacking U.S. ships in the Red Sea. Seems straightforward on the surface.
But here's where it gets tricky, right? The catch.
Exactly. Apparently, this deal put zero restrictions on the Houthis attacking Israel.
Wow. Okay. So U.S. ships safe, but Israeli interests not part of the deal.
That's the implication. And as you can imagine, this reportedly caused quite a bit of friction between Trump and Netanyahu.
Yeah, I can see why. A potential major shift in priorities there.
Definitely suggests a different strategic calculation, perhaps.
So what's the thinking behind this, according to the expert we're looking at? Why would Trump make that kind of deal?
The interpretation is that Trump was getting frustrated, with the U.S. Navy being tied down there for so long.
Right.
And he might have seen it as, well, kind of an embarrassing situation that he just wanted to end quickly.
Like out of it.
Pretty much. Now, it's important to note Trump himself apparently claimed the Houthis surrendered.
But the expert says there's not really much solid evidence to back up that specific claim. A surrender.
So maybe a gap between the public statement and the reality on the ground.
It often happens in these situations, yeah.
Yeah.
Highlights that potential gap.
Okay, so pulling back to the bigger picture again, what does this whole episode say about U.S. credibility, maybe?
That's a crucial point the expert raises. If a superpower like the U.S. seems unable to really deter or disable a group like the Houthis, that could potentially weaken the U.S. image globally, especially when you think about bigger potential conflicts.
Look with Iran or China down the road.
Precisely. It raises questions about the limits of military power in these asymmetric conflicts.
Interesting. Okay, let's connect this maybe to Ukraine, because there seem to be some inconsistencies there, too.
Yeah, definitely. The expert points out Trump's earlier statements about Ukraine were, well, a bit all over the place.
Okay.
He talked about ending the war very quickly, maybe forcing negotiations, even suggesting suspending aid at one point.
But that's not what happened in the end, right? Aid continued.
Exactly. He ultimately did continue providing aid to Ukraine.
So these kinds of reversals, how does the expert think Russia views this?
The analysis suggests Russia probably sees Trump as unpredictable, maybe erratic.
Like not entirely in control of U.S. policy levers?
Perhaps. Or that other forces within the U.S. system have significant influence on the final decisions. It creates uncertainty for them.
And we should probably mention the expert's own view on the Ukrainian government itself.
Yes, that's relevant context. This particular expert has, for a long time, described the government in Kyiv as a corrupt regime.
Okay.
And sees that as a key factor in how the conflict even started. That perspective definitely colors their analysis of U.S. involvement.
Got it. There was also that story about a pastor influencing Trump's decision on aid.
Right. The expert mentions a meeting Trump had with a pastor who claimed he'd witnessed Russian atrocities.
And this reportedly swayed Trump towards approving more aid?
That's the report. Although the expert does express some, let's say, skepticism about these kinds of anecdotal accounts. They mentioned past instances where similar claims didn't fully check out.
Okay, so adding it all up, the conflicting statements, the reversals, the different influences, what's the impact on, say, European allies?
The expert predicts they're likely feeling pretty uneasy right now. All this perceived instability, the inconsistency.
Yeah, it would make you nervous, wouldn't it, about future U.S. commitments?
Absolutely. It potentially shakes confidence in the reliability of U.S. policy and the whole transatlantic relationship, really.
Okay. Let's shift focus again, maybe to the broader Middle East, but setting Yemen aside for a moment, Netanyahu comes up again.
He does, and the expert's characterization, based on their analysis and reported interactions, is, well, quite blunt.
How so?
Described as arrogant, even sociopathic, and very demanding. Asking for a lot, but not offering much back.
That's a strong assessment.
It is, and it leads to the suggestion that maybe Trump just got tired of dealing with him.
The personal dynamic playing a role.
It can, sometimes. Though the expert cautions that even if Trump's personal view changed, the underlying risk of a bigger regional war, possibly started by Netanyahu, is still very real.
Geopolitics trumping personal feelings, so to speak.
Often, yes. Geopolitical realities tend to persist.
What about other regional issues? Saudi Arabia's nuclear ambitions.
Yeah, the expert mentions Trump was reportedly okay with the Saudis pursuing a nuclear program.
Which Israel wouldn't like, presumably?
Predictably, no. Israel reacted negatively given their own long-standing nuclear stance.
And Iran. Can the U.S. effectively pressure Iran, according to this view?
The expert is doubtful. They believe Russia and China would likely step in to support Iran, which would limit how much pressure the U.S. could actually apply successfully.
So maybe not forcing submission that way.
Unlikely in this analysis.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, despite all the tension, the expert doesn't rule out a future return to something like the JCPOA.
The Obama-era nuclear deal.
It's raised as a possibility. Maybe a return to diplomacy under different circumstances or leadership.
But for now, the risk of escalation is still high.
Very much so. The expert sees the situation as quite unpredictable, with several potential triggers for a wider conflict.
Such as?
Things like a major Israeli ground offensive in Gaza, for example. Egypt has stated that's a red line for them.
Okay.
Iran has apparently pledged to back Egypt if that line is crossed. And then you have Turkey, whose leader has his own regional ambitions and could potentially get involved.
So a lot of interconnected tripwires, basically.
A very volatile mix, yes.
Okay, let's pivot to something slightly different but connected. Trade wars and the economic side of things under Trump.
Right. The expert starts by reminding us, tariffs traditionally have a specific defensive purpose, protecting certain home industries.
Sure, from unfair competition, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the argument is that Trump's approach was much, much broader, almost treating everyone as an economic adversary.
Leading to widespread disputes.
Yes. And the consequence, according to this analysis, was a pretty significant global backlash. A lot of resentment built up.
And that has wider implications.
Yeah, fostering this desire among other countries to find ways around U.S. financial dominance, moving away from systems like SWIFT or the influence of the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and World Bank.
Because they felt targeted economically.
And that seems to be the expert's view, that these policies push nations to seek alternatives.
Now, how does this connect back home? The expert links it to domestic issues, specifically Gaza.
They do, highlighting how difficult it is for Trump, or potentially any U.S. president, to really shift policy on Gaza because of the strong influence of pro-Israel donors and lobbying groups. AIPAC is mentioned specifically.
The American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Correct, a major player. So that domestic political reality makes major shifts hard.
But the expert sees a potential catalyst for change, something about a financial crisis.
Yes, they predict a potential financial crisis in the U.S. maybe in the next 3 to 6 months.
Not soon.
That's the prediction. And the idea is that such a crisis could force a policy shift on issues like Gaza simply because domestic economic problems would become overwhelming.
Domestic priorities taking over.
Exactly. The expert also emphasizes the significant financial and media influence of the Israeli diaspora within the U.S., adding another layer of complexity.
It really shows how tangled these global and domestic threads are.
Absolutely. And the expert even suggests some overlap in interests. They posit that some entities pushing for confrontation with Iran might also be the same ones wanting continued involvement in Ukraine.
Like who? Any examples?
BlackRock is mentioned as one example, with potential interest tied to things like Ukrainian land or resources. It's a theory about interconnected financial motives.
Interesting. This seems to lead into a broader critique the expert has about Washington's mindset.
Yes, what they call a great power delusion. A failure to really grasp how much the world has changed, clinging to an outdated view of American dominance.
Like thinking the U.S. can just dictate terms everywhere.
Sort of. And tied to that is an analysis of Trump's personality. The expert mentions a narcissistic tendency, this drive to be seen as the deal maker.
Okay.
But the argument is that his primary tactic threats might work sometimes in business, but it's often ineffective, even counterproductive, in international relations.
Diplomacy requires more nuance.
Generally, yes. Threats can backfire or just be ignored if they lack credibility or backing.
Now, going back to Ukraine for a second, how does the expert frame Putin's perspective?
They present Putin's view as seeing the conflict fundamentally as addressing a direct security threat to Russia itself,
Okay.
and that his territorial aims are likely limited, perhaps up to the Dnieper River, based on historical and cultural factors, not necessarily aiming to conquer all of Ukraine.
And Putin's aware of Russia's own limits.
The expert emphasizes that, yes, Putin is seen as quite aware of Russia's economic constraints and resource limitations.
Which brings us neatly to the U.S. economy itself. The expert seems quite concerned.
Very concerned. They specifically advise watching the bond market very closely. U.S. Treasury bonds or gilts.
As a warning sign.
As an early indicator of instability? Yes. If that market shows distress, it often signals wider economic trouble ahead.
And the core problem is?
The national debt, the sheer size of it, combined with rising interest rates making it harder and harder to service that debt. It's seen as unsustainable.
Heading towards a potential crisis.
That's the fear. And the expert believes the U.S. has basically run out of road with using monetary policy, just printing money to fix these deep problems.
We can't just print our way out of it anymore.
The limits have been reached, according to this view. Compounding that, if they decline in foreign investment coming into the U.S.
Which we rely on.
Historically, yes. It's been crucial for funding our debt and maintaining our standard of living. If that dries up, it's a major problem.
And manufacturing. Is bringing it back helping?
The expert points out that high-end manufacturing has declined, and bringing it back is slow and difficult. Plus, there are challenges finding a skilled enough workforce domestically.
So economic fragility seems to be a major theme, and domestically, socially.
Also concerning, in the expert's view, they talk about deep societal divisions, particularly along racial lines.
To the point of comparing the U.S.
to the old Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah.
Fractured, divided, not like the more unified America of the mid-20th century. This internal division weakens the country overall.
Okay. Let's jump over to South Asia. India and Pakistan, always a tense spot.
Always. The expert touches on the long-running issues, especially Kashmir, of course.
And suggests potential outside meddling.
Raises the possibility, yeah. Mentions the CIA or Mossad perhaps having some involvement in stirring the pot in that region, though without presenting hard proof. It's more of a recurring suspicion based on past patterns.
And this fits into a critique of U.S. foreign policy thinking.
Yes, this idea of a black and white worldview. If you're not fully aligned with the U.S., you're automatically seen as an enemy. The expert argues this is just flawed, counterproductive.
From a U.S. strategic angle, what about the BRICS alliance? India's part of that.
Right. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. The expert thinks the U.S. would naturally want to counter BRICS' growing influence.
So pulling India away would be seen as a win?
Likely, yes. Anything that weakens that bloc would probably be welcomed in Washington. However, the expert also credits leaders like Modi in India and Xi in China with showing actually quite a bit of restraint despite ongoing tensions.
Okay, so the current India-Pakistan situation is simmering.
Described as a low-intensity conflict. Probably one that both sides actually want to avoid escalating into a full war, given the nuclear risks.
Right.
But the expert reiterates their view about agencies like the CIA and Mossad potentially engaging in dirty tricks to provoke conflict sometimes.
Any specifics mentioned in relation to this region?
They bring up the Baloch separatist movement active in the border areas of Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan,
Okay.
and suggest a potential, though unconfirmed, link between that movement and Mossad efforts aimed at destabilizing Iran from its eastern border.
Kind of like the old Great Game.
An analogy is drawn, to that historical British-Russian rivalry. But the expert seems to think current efforts might be less sophisticated, maybe more clumsy.
So the expert's recommendation for U.S. policy here.
Stay out of it, essentially. Urge de-escalation between India and Pakistan. Don't get involved or try to pick sides.
And this ties into a larger point about understanding other powers.
Exactly. A key theme is that Washington often underestimates the sophistication, the historical depth, the strategic thinking of non-Western powers, like Russia, China, Iran, Turkey.
They're not seen accurately.
The argument is they're often viewed through a simplistic lens, missing their complexities and capabilities. Iran's progress in missile technology is given as one specific example.
An area where they've advanced significantly.
Apparently so. The expert also kind of critiques the West for seeming constantly surprised by China's tech achievements, like in AI.
As if we shouldn't expect them to innovate.
Right. The expert feels the U.S. is missing chances for cooperation by focusing so much on countering competition.
It leads to a pretty provocative idea the expert puts forward.
Yeah, the idea that maybe it's the West that's increasingly seen as the disruptive force now.
The new barbarians, as it were.
That's the phrase used, yeah. While other nations are trying to build, cooperate, and progress, it's a stark perspective.
And the U.S. is seen as repeating old mistakes.
Specifically, adopting historical British imperial strategies, manipulating global forces, divide and rule, which the expert thinks is a fundamental mistake for the U.S. today.
So what could force a change in U.S. policy, according to this view?
Back to the economy. A major U.S. economic crisis, maybe even something like bankruptcy, forcing a reset. Similar to what happened to Britain after World War II, losing its empire due to economic constraints.
Leading to big cuts.
Potentially huge cuts to the defense budget, which the expert sees as completely unsustainable long-term anyway.
And domestic spending.
Entitlement programs would also likely face major adjustments. The financial pressure would be immense.
And our ability to ask for help internationally.
Eroded. The expert argues the tariff wars, the threats, have damaged goodwill, made it harder for the U.S. to rally support when it faces its own problems.
The debt situation really seems central.
Absolutely. The expert mentions historical U.S. debt restructurings or defaults, implying the current situation is reaching a similar breaking point. Unsustainable.
And the political pressure at home will shift.
Towards domestic needs, the expert believes. People demanding investment in things like hospitals here, rather than massive defense spending abroad. That pressure will grow.
And the rest of the world.
The observation is that much of the world is just moving on, less concerned with Western dramas, focused on their own paths.
There's one last, quite alarming point the expert makes about Israel.
Yes, the concept of a greater Israel project.
What does that entail?
It's described as a perceived expansionist agenda, symbolized, reportedly, by a map patch seen on some IDF uniforms depicting a much larger territory than Israel's current recognized borders, encompassing parts of neighboring countries.
That's quite a claim.
It's presented as a serious concern within this analysis, reflecting a maximalist territorial ambition.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, quite a tour.
True.
What are the absolute key takeaways from this expert's analysis?
I'd say first, potential big shifts in unpredictability in U.S. foreign policy. Second, serious questions about U.S. credibility and its image as a superpower. Third, a very fragile U.S. economic picture, potentially nearing a crisis. And fourth, this broader shift in global power, where the U.S. isn't the only game in town anymore, and maybe Washington hasn't fully caught up to that reality.
That is definitely a lot to think about, but hopefully breaking it down like this gives you a clearer, more nuanced picture of these really complex global issues without just adding to the noise.
Yeah, hopefully providing some structure to understand these different threads.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given everything we've just discussed from this expert's viewpoint, what do you see as the single biggest challenge facing the U.S. globally in the next few years? And maybe what's an unexpected ripple effect from these trends that we haven't even touched on?
That's a good question to ponder.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.